All right, we've got economics reporter for the Washington Post. Our great friend Jeff Stein is here with a big scoop this morning, too. Great to see you, Jeff.
Good to see you, sir.
Thank you guys so much for having me back on.
So you got some great insight into what exactly happened with regards to the eviction moratorium, how Biden, I mean, this was a complete flip-flop and turnabout. So what were those conversations like behind the scenes?
Yeah, so I know your audience, they're not that interested in substance. They just want to know who's up, who's down.
Horse race.
Yeah.
The Washington Insider.
What's going on with Mr. Potato Head?
Who was spotted most recently at the Georgetown party?
You can't get that kind of stuff from Morning Joe. You will get that here on Breaking.
That's our core.
Right.
That is our core offering.
So I can give you the inside scoop inside the White House.
All right, tell us.
And what happened essentially is that as pressure grew from Representative Cori Bush and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi on the eviction moratorium, you guys did a great job of covering that last week. The White House and President Biden in particular designated his chief of staff, Ron Klain, to find an alternative legal basis for extending the ban. The White House legal counsel had come up with an opinion that Biden had accepted that said that you did not have the authority to do this.
Got it.
And
what is the timeline on all? When did that opinion come out? And then when did he say, hey, Klain, you got to figure this out?
I'm not sure precisely when she came up with the opinion. I know that by the week before the moratorium extended, there was a private White House meeting and discussions. Gene Sperling, Brian Deese, and Susan Rice were all involved in a discussion to say, hey, is there something we can do to get this going? And the White House counsel office said no. By the weekend, Ron Klain and President Biden are talking about, what can we do here? Pelosi is adamant that this is the administration's responsibility and they have to figure out how to do it. So what happened was Ron Klain called Lawrence Tribe, who's a Harvard professor, and said, is there any alternative explanation? Tribe comes up with a defense, basically, which we can get into in a second. But it says essentially, if we do a targeted moratorium for places where they're dealing with COVID, very significantly, that is separate from what the Supreme Court warned against and therefore valid. And Tribe also worked extensively with the White House counsel's office. They come up with a justification. White House counsel's office changes its mind, gets behind that, and by I think it's Tuesday,
they're out.
They're on board.
So that's interesting. So basically, he had accepted this guidance. Then, okay, so talk about the public pressure then. Like, what were the levers and what were the arguments being made? Obviously, Cori Bush is on TV. People like us are covering it. A lot of other people are covering it. But then also you have Nancy Pelosi, who's in this bind. Maybe you could talk a bit about that, which is that, I mean, as Rokana said on our show, the truth is, like, some Democrats in the caucus did not want to extend this moratorium. So, like, what was she doing behind the scenes here?
I mean, the White House sources I've talked to have said primarily that your segment was what moved the needle here.
Oh, right, of course.
Yeah, but beyond breaking points, Pelosi spent the weekend in conversations with senior White House officials. She called Klain, Steve Ricchetti, one of the president's closest aides, and it's my understanding that she spoke to the president 3 separate times after the president kicked the ball to Congress and before the new moratorium was announced. I think, this is obviously, the potential for a human tragedy was immense, and in many cases still is. But there's also the political ramifications of the White House dealing with headlines about, in the middle of a pandemic in many states, Missouri, Georgia, Arizona.
Oh, are those important?
Potentially important states with millions of people at risk of losing their homes. And I think this is kind of the fundamental tension that the White House is currently wrestling with. They are trying to project that the economy is coming back, that this is a time to, and that, especially before the Delta, that they wanted to present an aura of economic normalcy. But the pandemic era government protections are beginning to expire. And though there's a conflict there, how do we present our economy as rebounding, as us moving beyond the pandemic without letting, while keeping these extraordinary government measures in place? So I think that was what they were wrestling with. And I don't know personally. I have people in the White House who told me that Biden was always open to extending it, but just was constrained by counsel's office. I think that many of your listeners will be skeptical of that explanation. I think we should be skeptical as well.
I'm skeptical of that,
Well, I do want to ask, though, because part of what is so perplexing here is the timing, because it wasn't a mystery that, the Supreme Court had ruled in this way. It was not a mystery that the funds that were allocated were not actually getting in the hands of tenants to make them home. It wasn't a mystery that the state was the deadline for the eviction moratorium, and yet no one acted until the very last minute. So focusing, I guess, I'd like to know both from Biden and Pelosi. Biden gets whatever this decision is from counsel that says, hey, you can't do it. But he doesn't say anything about it till the end of last week when the moratorium's about to expire. When we talked to Congressman Khanna, his impression, or what he said to us, is that there was an expectation from Pelosi and others in the House that the CDC was going to do some kind of an eviction moratorium, and that they truly were sort of caught off guard that didn't happen. On the other hand, the Supreme Court ruling is pretty clear. Congress has got to do something if you want this to be extended, and the House also didn't move to do anything whatsoever. So why did this come down to the last minute, to the point where, as your paper was covering, the evictions did go forward?
I think we have it
during the lapse.
Yeah.
There were a few days there where people were kicked out of their homes and left in this terrible limbo where they have no idea whether they're going to be there or not. So how did it come down to the last minute like that?
I think your summary there is excellent and captures really well exactly that what you just said, that this was a fiasco, and that it's very hard to understand exactly why the White House, even if they concluded, as you said, that there was no legal justification, on what possible basis can they defend waiting until 2 days before the moratorium lapses to inform Congress? Senator Dick Durbin, the number 2 ranking Senate Democrat, told reporters that someone dropped the ball, which is, it sounds like a very meek quote in a lot of ways, but for a member of Senate Democratic leadership to actively assert that is a really big deal, and a sign of the amount of dysfunction there was here. I think, some people I talked to in the White House have said, look, we were caught flat-footed by the Delta variant. Like, we saw the economy reopening, and we felt that things were headed in the right direction. There were some positive GDP numbers, there's some positive jobs numbers. The vaccination campaign is going well. Then I think there was this mistaken belief that insofar as Delta would be a problem, it would be localized, it would be, concentrated in the regions where, vaccination rates are lowest, which is partially true, but the extent to which Delta is still a problem beyond that is really striking. And, I talked to one senior administration official who I quoted in a Washington Post report saying, like, what are we doing here, guys? Like, why is this taking so long? And
I remember you were covering this weeks before it even happened.
Yeah.
And then I kept being like, are they going to do anything? Are they going to do anything? And it's just nothing happened.
It was really extraordinary. And then for them to be like, we're doing all we can, when we were asking them about this weeks and weeks ago, and they had no explanation. I mean, I think to the credit, maybe to try to explain what they're thinking a little bit more, is they think that the core problem, and I think they're right about this, the core problem is that the rental relief money is not getting out.
Yeah.
And even the most left-leaning housing advocates I talk to say, Treasury and Yellen are doing really everything within their power, within the confines. I thought you had a really good point on the last podcast about, Krystal pointed out that, like, this could have been done by the federal government.
Yeah.
And instead they ran it through the states.
Right.
Which was, I think many people would say, was a mistake. But within that construct, Yellen in particular has been very aggressive in saying, states and cities, push out this money to poor people, and we will not, as treasuries have done in the past, hit you with a punitive audit. Like, they are laser focused on getting this money out. And I think they're right that is the fundamental issue here, and that you can extend the moratorium for another 3 years.
Right.
But if people are not able to pay the back rent that they've accumulated over months and months and months, I know the left doesn't like it when you say this, but a lot of landlords who are not giant corporations are going to go out of business.
Yeah. And then BlackRock is going to buy up those properties, and that's not great from a left perspective either.
Right. It's stupid to erase that. The vast majority of landlords in America are small landlords. And I'm not saying these are like, the paragons of society or whatever, but like they're middle class in many respects.
It's just a shitty situation.
Right, exactly. It's like, look, you can't have this, especially in a property owning society, which I want for everybody. And I think, you shouldn't, downplay that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I do want to know more about how and why that program failed, because I do think, look, on the one hand, you got to, say these states and localities have done a poor job in many instances of being able to get this money out. But you also have to say, when you see this is basically failure across the board, there clearly was a flaw in the way that the program was set up. Why are these localities having so much trouble being able to disperse these funds in a way that would help to alleviate the crisis?
So that's a great question. And I think just to give a little bit of background, Congress has approved $46 billion in rental assistance from my understanding, I think it's like about $3 billion has been spent, and there's more than 25, the estimates vary, but more than $25 billion in back payments. That is really not enough money for the need. The core of the issue, as I understand it, is basically that states and cities are used to and have gotten dinged for not doing this, but they are saying what we need is documentation and proof from the landlord and from the tenant of, when did you lose your job? Can you provide proof that you lost your job? Can you provide proof of an income hit? Can you provide proof of the hardship that you've undergone?
Oh, so you have a mountain of paper.
A lot of people don't have that. And not only do people not have that, the states and cities often, like little cities that don't have a ton of staff. Some of them are trying to hire temp workers at the last minute, but that's a very hard lift. So the states and cities are looking at this program and saying, in the past, we've given out money that we thought we were being responsible about, and then the next year, the federal government will say, hey, why didn't this money get to the people who deserve it? You gave it to person X incorrectly. We're going to fine you. And so people who run state treasuries and city treasuries are understandably hypersensitive about that happening to them. So they are, even though the current treasury is trying to say, go spend the money, they're still insisting on a lot of these documentation requirements that make it very, very hard for low-income people to meet. I was just talking to a really excellent housing expert, Paul Williams, at the Jane Family Institute, and he was making the point that Yellen has even said to these states and cities that they can just look at the median income within a certain, I don't remember municipality or what the exact designation is, and push out the money on that basis.
Huh.
Oh, interesting.
That's like 10 years ago, in the height of deficit hysteria, that would be an unbelievable political scandal, right? But Yellen is, I think, to a lot of the housing experts' joy, is actually just saying, just go spend the money and we will not come back for it and hit you for it later. And they don't believe her.
So err on the side of getting the money out rather than being we must not have any waste, fraud, or abuse.
And
which
I
is
understand,
very different.
right?
Yeah.
But then you have, I get it. I get the hesitancy because reporters and people in the media like myself will then write stories all the money was misspent.
Here's this grifter
Look
who
at
got millions or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I remember seeing that about, it's dead people got X million. I was like, guys, it's $1 trillion bill. You're talking about 0.01% of the bill. This is
who
all
also
back.
gets Social Security?
Yeah, that's
dead people.
Yeah, it's always such an annoying scandal. So then let's talk. I think we have a Washington Post story, so if we can put that on the screen, just about what exactly is being covered here in terms of 80% of the population. So I also saw reports of 90% of the population.
It's a little confusing. My understanding.
So 80%, 90%. What is actually being covered here? Well, let's explain that, I think, a little bit to the audience, because people will say, oh, the Biden administration obviously using the most expansive definition. So 80% are covered. For how long? What are the legal ramifications? Does the White House expect to lose in court? If so, how soon? What are these guys thinking?
So I don't remember the precise categories, but if the community spread of COVID is above a certain level in that community, the 80-90 thing is a little confusing, and I had that confusion too.
Right.
Essentially, it's 80% of counties will be covered, but within that 80% of counties, it's 90% of the population.
Okay, got it.
What was your other question about what they're thinking?
In
What's
terms
gonna
of
happen
the
with the
legal
courts?
ramifications.
Oh, and the legal, so there's
think?
two things I want to say on the legal ramifications. One, there's a very interesting section of the moratorium that includes over a year of jail time for a landlord who knowingly violates the rule, which is a very big deal.
Whoa.
And it will be very interesting, especially if any landlords initiated legal proceedings before this was in place, will people then try to say after the fact. We know that the Realtors Association filed a lawsuit last night to stop this, but I'm a little out of my depth on what is going to happen in the courts here, but my understanding is it could be weeks before they take this up.
Oh, okay.
Which could be a huge deal. I think the hope is that they don't take this up till October. That's sort of when the court is going to be back, I think.
Right.
And so the expectation is that's why they extended the moratorium until October 3rd under the new guidance.
Because that's when the court comes back. That makes sense.
So it's not just the eviction moratorium that is set to end in terms of pandemic relief. You've got also mortgage forbearance. You've got student loan debt forbearance. You have expanded SNAP program. You have unemployment insurance. This is another thing you've been really pushing and pointing out is the fact that 20 million people are set to lose unemployment insurance in a fairly short period of time. How were they thinking about those economic supports?
I would love to know. I mean, I spoke to someone in the White House maybe a week ago, and I said, look, you guys clearly have an eviction crisis issue where you asked Congress to extend this, 2 days before the deadline lapsed. So I think it's really, really critical that we distinguish here between the $300 federal unemployment supplement.
Yep.
That is, you guys know this, but that is going to expire on September 6th. That is also really important, but put that aside for a second. That covers, I think, maybe 15, 12 million people. Separately, there's what I would refer to as base pandemic unemployment benefits. These are benefits for people who would otherwise not be getting a dime in unemployment because they're not covered under the traditional UI system. Particularly, this program was set up for gig workers, self-employed people, independent contractors. This is, I think, the numbers are around 8, 9 million people. And setting aside what to do about the people who are getting the bonus, the extra UI amount, we need to understand what the White House's position is on that 9 million who are about to go to zero as Delta surges and as mask mandates and restrictions come back in some parts of the country. As I was saying, I was speaking to someone in the administration about this, they were saying that they don't think the political will exists in Congress to extend that program for people who are going to go to zero, which to me indicates that we are heading in the exact same direction, where the minute before this is about to expire for millions and millions of people, they could say, Congress, you guys want to pass this? They might be right at some level that Congress doesn't want to pass this. Like that might be I think that actually is the truth, but there is no chance at all of it passing if the administration does not say we want to do it.
Well, here's the thing. You can't have it both ways. You can't have mask mandates and restrictions and then not have pandemic support. Yeah, it's like you have to choose. And like if you want to be free, which I support, fine, so be it. But if you don't, then you have to provide people assistance. It really is just a splitting the difference. I mean, so Jeff, we have the pandemic restrictions, all of that, but you've also been doing a lot of work here on the infrastructure bill and everything that's happening. We have the lobbying story, which we teased, which is that there is a bonanza, this is from the Washington Post, of exactly how many lobbyists are trying to get their little pet things in the bill. So can you explain to us what exactly is going on with this timeline? Because I still am relatively unclear. We are talking today on Thursday. As I hear it, there's a vote on the bipartisan infrastructure bill. It could come on Saturday. But then reconciliation also begins. So what is the timeline on these two things? And then we'll get into the specifics.
There's a lot of rumors flying around DC, and I feel like it's a kind of a hard story to like make interesting because it's like today they
Senate
filed
procedure,
cloture. It's so much procedure. It's so boring. I want to get my eyes out when I try to talk about this. My understanding, as you said, is that Schumer I guess he has to file 2 motions for cloture to proceed to the underlying bill. Then they start the amendment.
Bipartisan.
For the bipartisan.
Yeah.
Then they start the amendment process, which could take forever and likely will, especially because, as you said, everyone and the lobbyist friends that they have will want to sneak something in.
Yep.
So it's possible that the Senate, my understanding is that it's possible the Senate actually moves to pass this next week.
Okay.
But I don't know beyond that what the timing is. And I have also heard that, so basically the second reconciliation package is so, God,
The 3.5 trillion.
Yeah.
The big one.
I hate that I'm going to say this.
Yeah.
That what has to happen with that is that the Senate first has to pass what's called a budget resolution.
Yes.
Which is the instructions to the committees to start writing the budget document that then they can pass through reconciliation.
Yep.
That could start, the budget resolution process could start on Monday.
Okay.
There's this like physics problem that Congress is dealing with where like the second that the bipartisan group feels that the reconciliation group package is moving, then then they will stop progress on the bipartisan bill.
Okay.
Right? But the people who are pushing for the reconciliation bill cannot advance on that unless the people who are supportive of the bipartisan infrastructure deal are also satisfied. So you
Right.
have this like they're both approaching the tunnel at the same time, and somehow they like have to move through it, but also there's no space for both of them at the same time.
Yeah.
Right.
So
So
mix my infrastructure metaphors.
this was the part I was trying to figure out. When I spoke to Senator Sanders, he was very confident that there will not be a bipartisan infrastructure deal unless we have all 50 Democrats on board for something close to the reconciliation deal that Senator Sanders wants. And I asked him, I said, well, do you have assurances at this point that, that all 50 are going to be on board? And he's like, he didn't really answer that. He was like, I'm just telling you, we're not going to do the infrastructure one without this one. I was like, okay, so how can they assure that? What are the mechanics there to make sure that you don't end up with, the bipartisan infrastructure deal, which from a progressive perspective is kind of meh, and has some parts in it that are actively bad, and then don't ever get to the $3.5 trillion, or it's dramatically reduced by the Mansion Cinemas, Josh Gottheimers, or whoever of the world.
I think for progressives and for a lot of other people, this is like the core of what's happening in the Biden presidency. This is the most important question, because if you look at the infrastructure package, immediately, the attacks flow instantly from the left, especially if this is going to be Biden's last big legislative achievement.
Which
Yeah.
it probably is. Yeah.
By the White House's own admission, it does far too inadequate on social services, safety net, home care, nothing for childcare, and then the big one is the climate component. The interesting thing, I think, is that we have this new Pelosi-Sanders alliance where Pelosi is also saying no bipartisan deal unless we get the reconciliation package. But my understanding and this is a little preliminary and a little speculative, but my rough understanding right now is that cinema is emerging as a lot of people are more worried about cinema right now than they are about Manchin.
So I'm hearing the same thing.
Interesting. Yeah. And there's a sense that she is much more uneasy and wants to make a much bigger fight on the reconciliation package than Manchin. And when they announced the $3.5 trillion agreement, Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, one of the centrist Senate Democrats, was in the room as part of that agreement. And the key question I couldn't get an answer to at the time was, is Mark Warner negotiating here on behalf of the entire centrist wing, or is he negotiating for Mark Warner? And I think a lot of people in the progressive community and a lot of Hill aides on the progressive side were optimistic that Warner was speaking for Manchin and Sinema.
Yep.
I don't think that's the case. I think that 3.5 was the compromise to get Warner, and now they're going to have to compromise again to get Sinema and Manchin. And we could see a number shrink, I think, down to 2.5. And
wow.
I think the lower you go, the more you risk Sanders and Warren saying.
Well, also the
hell no.
House.
Yeah.
You also have the
And
House who may not vote for it.
Yeah.
Especially on those climate pieces. So what do you think could get left out? I know that's entirely speculative, but
On the reconciliation?
yeah.
I think relative to the White House's initial plan, a lot of the things that they pushed for my understanding of the way they're trying to do this budget math is to say, for instance, they initially called for $400 billion in home care, which is this huge problem we have in this country where elderly people cannot get basically care in the home because Medicaid really prefers to push people towards nursing homes, which, as we saw during the pandemic, is not always the best idea. We have a rapidly aging population. So the White House came up $400 billion for this, a big ask of unions that got behind Biden early on. I think what my understanding from sources is basically that they're going to keep the initial plan of per year spending for home care, for instance, but cut the duration of the program.
Yeah.
So they'll do 1 or 2 years with the expectation that
They have to renew.
They will have to renew. I think there's understandable debate about whether that's the best measure, but relative to Biden's plan, the big addition was including Medicare, dental, vision, and hearing, and that's a very expensive program. That's I think it's $200-300 billion. So that's forcing them to wrestle with other trade-offs. What else are they going to have to shrink? I think the child tax credit that Biden wanted for 5 years in his initial plan, I think that could shrink further. Someone close to the administration was making the point to me that while this sounds inadequate and sounds far from the New Deal, that actually FDR, I didn't know this, and I looked it up, and it actually seems to check out. A lot of the New Deal programs started with trials, essentially, a few years.
Yeah, that's true.
Social Security didn't actually come online until 4 or 5 years or something like that after it was passed. I mean, obviously, like we should be able to do things faster now than we could in the 30s and 40s, but that's their theory, that once these things get rolling, they will be impossible for Republicans to roll back.
We'll see.
I don't know about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I have to come back to the timeline because Sinema at the same time, and this is publicly reported, is saying, I am not staying for recess. I'm going on vacation and I don't care how long it takes. So when is any of this supposed to pass? Like, because she's saying there that the reconciliation has to be done before her vacation, which, what is it, next week, right? August 16th? So how are they supposed to pass two major pieces of spent $4 trillion in a single week? That just does not seem like it's going to work right now.
I think the one caveat is that
Yeah.
the reconciliation thing that they would pass next week is probably the budget resolution.
Oh, so that's it. Okay. All right.
I think that's
Okay.
what I see happening is essentially, this is a guess, but informed guess. I think this week the Senate passes the bipartisan infrastructure deal and either passes or moves forward on the budget resolution. That sounds like a really bad scenario for the left because obviously they are desperate to have the rest of the
And then you have a month to negotiate.
But I think Pelosi will come out and say, we're not passing this right away.
Right. Which she's already said.
Which she's already said. So that will kind of cool tensions. They'll go for recess and they'll come back, and then then we'll have to see if the Senate can then pass the budget reconciliation and then send it to the House and clear both. I think that could take a few more months.
Yeah, that's a long.
It's not going to be done
process.
next week. No chance. We haven't seen anything.
Thank you. Yeah, I keep
so
asking this question. I'm like, what's happening?
Yeah, no, there's nothing to read or analyze. So yeah, it's very confusing for sure.
Talk to me about the pay-fors in the reconciliation bill.
Oh, fun.
Because
the reconciliation bill. Okay.
Because we covered here, I'm sure you saw this Exxon lobbyist who basically was like, when the things are popular, we don't go after the things. We go after the pay-fors. And that pulls back the dollar amount, and then that helps protect us in terms of climate change legislation. And lo and behold, you see Manchin in particular taking a similar tack of saying, look, we can't raise taxes too much. This is what I'm really concerned about. And he also has expressed some concern over some of the climate change provisions. So what are the proposed sort of changes to the tax code and largest pieces in terms of the pay-fors for the $3.5 trillion, which they've drawn this red line around, we're going to pay for every dollar? And which pieces of that do you think are most controversial?
I think, and it's an interesting question, the least controversial, I would say just the things that I think they'll definitely get done, or there's pretty broad consensus in the Democratic Party. Increase enforcement at the IRS to go after tax cheats. There's lots of credible estimates that could raise over $1 trillion. I mean, CBO might find a lower number, but there's real money there. So that gets you a third of the way there. I think the other major components, the corporate tax rate will go up, probably to 25, but we'll see where Sinema is on that. The international provisions are really important. There's over $1 trillion in savings there. They'll probably pare that back a little bit. This is very complicated, and I frankly don't understand all of it. But it essentially will be methods to try to prevent outsourcing to ensure that corporations are required to book their profits here and be exposed to the U.S. corporate tax. So there's that. The top rate on the biggest corporate earners will go up. That's not a ton of money, but it will be some. Although it will be counteracted in all likelihood as Democrats seek to pare back the state and local tax deduction cap, which is always a fun topic. And the other big thing I would mention, Senator Ron Wyden, chair of the Finance Committee, is pushing very aggressively to pare back a very large tax deduction that was approved for pass-through companies, which are incorporated differently than, you guys know this, than corporations, but Senator Ron Johnson, who happens to own a pass-through corporation, a pass-through company, ensured that there was that deduction in the 2017 Republican tax cut. So
Thank you, sir.
that's actually, it's nice for Democrats because now that's money on the table that they can collect and pay for the other things. So I would just say, I think there's an also very interesting story about the pay-fors for the bipartisan infrastructure deal.
Sure.
Because they went into this saying essentially, okay, it's a bipartisan group of senators, so Republicans are going to rule out any tax hikes, especially rich and corporations. That's totally off. That's what the White House wanted. The White House said nothing to increase taxes or fees on people earning less than $400,000 a year. Spending cuts are also off the table in the White House's view. And they also want to say it's paid for. So they want a deal where they spend $500 billion in new funding. They don't want any new taxes, and they don't want to cut any spending. So then you left with this like,
yeah, what do you do?
what do you do, right?
Yeah.
So this has been a fun story I've been covering because they have what budget experts are just smoke and mirrors and gimmicks. And they initially started with, they said that they were going to find $100 billion in UI fraud and cut that out. I think we did the numbers and it was like that was a fourth of UI projected spending overall over that period. So, and I think it was like twice the amount of projected UI fraud. So it was not credible that they were gonna, so they gave up on that. Then they came back and said, you know, what we'll do now is we'll repurpose COVID aid that was unspent. So the White House said no COVID aid from the rescue plan, but there's other COVID aid approved under Trump that we can maybe look at repurposing. But this is also, I mean, we're expecting the CBO score that will expose this soon, but this was also what budget experts would call a gimmick because the COVID aid that they're saying is being repurposed was actually basically the delta between what was initially projected to be spent and what was ultimately spent.
Yep.
So there's nothing in the law they are passing that lowers the amount of spending on COVID aid or repurposes it. They're just saying, we expected this much to be spent, only this much was spent. That savings we can use to apply. Yeah, so there's another really fun example. They're saying that, I'll give you two more.
Do it, yeah.
The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, they're saying we're gonna sell parts of that and then use that as a pay for.
Okay.
The thing is, they have to fill it up.
Yeah, exactly. You can't sell.
But buying it comes later, so it's not.
This is like BS accounting tricks. What's the last one?
The last one I'll give you is the like auctions for Spectrum, like to the companies that do the 5G sales. For that, they're counting a sale that occurred in February as counting, but like that sale happens. It's not.
Right, we already booked the revenue.
Time is weird. I don't know. It's crazy.
It's an interesting thing. Look, I think that a lot of people will get a lot from this because this is how this stuff all actually works and the behind the scenes. So we can't thank you enough, man. Like, thank you for explaining it all to us. If you could come away from that, a lot of people would pay real money in order to pick your brain on this. So we appreciate it. Thanks, dude.
Thank you,
I expect my paycheck from you guys.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. Right.
Always great to see
They'll start
you.
asking
I'll pay you in one of those nice Cuomo-sexual pillows that I posted on Twitter. Yeah.
Give me
I know,
a
it's right
Taco
behind the
couple of
curtain.
those.
Give you a Taco Bell gift card.
Great to see you, Jeff.
Thank you, guys.
Good to see you, Jeff. Thanks for everybody for watching. Appreciate it. We'll see you guys later.